my question was, okay, so look, if you have Broca's area, you have agrammatism. So agrammatism is very, very highly associated with Broca's area, and that's a specific impairment of certain grammatical competence, right? For instance, to be able to understand and produce the right function words, so prepositions, connectives, articles, quantifiers, and negation, right? So if you have a damage to Broca's area, then you have this grammatical deficit, and then you have the activation of Broca's area for these studies we reviewed about like specific syntactic processing. So there is a nice correspondence between lesional studies and activation studies. But what about the insula, right? So my question is, do you have any specific correlation between the localized damage to the insular cortex, which is what they found active in their experiment, and deficits, for instance, to understanding negation, right? And I'm afraid that the answer to that question is not really. So I mentioned you that when you have the damage to the insular the anterior insula, usually you have more deficits that are associated to pitch comprehension and pitch processing. So pitch like, vocal pitch. So the frequency of your formant, right? Which is very important to process intonation and prosody. And also you have deficit at initiating speech. So problems at starting to produce an utterance, but it doesn't really seem that you have specific deficit to semantics. So that would suggest that probably the reason why, I mean, we don't really know why the reason that they got the specific activation of insula in this kind of formal semantics, processing of less compared to more. So probably with this involvement of some sort of negation, abstract negation. But one of the reasons could be that the anterior insula, rather than being a specific processor for this kind of information, is a sort of an important part of the network. So it connects certain regions of the inferior frontal cortex, right? So Broca's area, but also the more anterior part of Broca's area, which is more important to semantics, connects that part to other parts, like, for instance, the temporal region. So what you have below the Sylvian fissure, right? So in a way, these areas that are more involved into semantics and lexical processing, to the areas that are more involved in syntactic processing. So you see, the insular cortex might be very important, but not because it is the processor or because it does contain those kind of abstract representation which abstract over certain kind of information, but maybe it is just a sort of a controller or a relay station that it takes information from other areas and retransmit that information to the frontal areas, right? So that's a possibility. Yes, Alice.
Isn't insula also involved in emotions?
Yes.
So how do you connect this to what
right? So this is an interesting issue about what we talked about, multimodality, right? So that we said that when you see if an area is multimodal, you don't really know if like it is because like this area is actually the sort of a grouping of different sub areas, right? Each of the sub area is specialized for processing different information, or if the whole area is active with respect to processing in like computation involving different functions, right? So to make it simple, is it the case that the whole the whole insula is processing this kind of different information like emotion, phonology, and let's say semantics or other cognitive information, or you have a separation with respect to the insula? So what we know about this is that actually there is a separation with respect to insula, right? So Let me see. Again, I hope I'm going to finish this review at some point before the end of the class so I can send it to you. But so the idea is that, let me read it, that like, so the posterior portion of insula, if you look at the connection of the connection pattern, the posterior portion is connected primarily to the posterior temporal cortex, parietal, sensory motor, and serves as a multimodal convergence role for sensorial information and action perception. Whereas the anterior insula is more connected to the anterior cingulate cortex, the frontal orbitofrontal, the anterior and superior temporal cortices, and it is associated with more cognitive and emotional processes, right? So here goes with the answer to your question.
Do you mean the anterior?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And within the anterior part, they claim that the dorsal portion of the anterior part is more important for cognition. So for cognitive processing. So I guess what they mean by cognition here is more like speech processing. Okay. So like semantics, word processing, and stuff like this. So, and so yeah. So then the idea is that the posterior part is more important for sensory motor processing, right? So for sensorial, for lower level sensorial processing, the posterior part, and the anterior part is more important for processing different kind of information. So more higher level information like pitch, phonology, or more speech related or emotion related information. But then within the anterior portion, a more dorsal portion is more involved in speech processing, and the other portion is more related to emotion processing. Okay. So, the simple answer is we don't know for sure, but it looks like that within this this area you was talking about, the ID7, right? There is also some kind of functional parcellation. Okay. The problem is that it's not easy to find a specific area of the insula that is selective for semantics. So big mystery. Okay. But then again, if you want to find this kind of areas that are super multimodal and they integrate a lot of kind of information throughout the brain, then almost all the areas we talked about to some extent behave like this, right? Except maybe for certain portion of the superior temporal gyrus, which seems to be very, very specific to speech and phonological processing and connecting phonological processing to lexical processing. But if you look at areas like the most anterior part of the temporal lobe, which is called temporal poles, right? Then you have a lot of afferences from memory, emotions, sensorial, and motor areas. And the same thing seems to happen for the insular cortex, okay? So this area seems to be hub, receiving a lot of information from a lot of modalities, and then we don't really know what they do with this kind of information. So they might just retransmit this information to different areas which actually encode more sort of abstract level representation, starting from this more lower level information, okay? So we are going to talk about that in the next class. But what I said seems, was it understandable, first of all? Was it kind of clear? Okay, good, thanks. All right, so let's go to our, so yeah, thanks for the comments and the questions. I got a few more questions from you, but maybe we're going to talk about that next time, or maybe later after the break, because I forgot to look into that. So today we just start our Psycholinguistics Electrified. Let me put it screen. And let me check. Okay. Do you all see the slides?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Let me also show the chat so I see if you write anything. Nice. Okay. So also, one of the nice thing about discussing ERP studies is that, as you will see, they sort of tackle these issues about syntax and semantics processing from a different perspective. And they are also useful to sort of move a little bit from more syntactic issues to more semantic issues, okay? So we also use it. So the purpose of this discussion is going to be twofold, right? One is to introduce you to this topic about ERP experiments. And the other one is also to have an excuse to move a little bit from syntax to semantics. Yeah. All right. So I told you already a little bit what the EEG does, right? So recording electric current on your scalp, more sensitive to dendritic potential rather than action potential, right? So you need a lot of active population of neurons in order to get a decent ERP effect. And the nice thing about this is that people used it, and here I'm talking about a paper by Frederici 2002 and also a chapter of Psycholinguistics Electrified. So I think I posted them in the articles. If I haven't, please let me know. So the ERP's methodology is really useful to study the interaction of language domains, okay? If we don't want to use the word modules. Domain of syntax, domain of semantics, pragmatics, and phonology, and how these different guys interact in real time processing, as well as also the influence of other non-linguistic cognitive processes on syntax, like working memory, for instance, okay? And also people use this to try to fractionate probably syntactic processing into these distinct stages, okay? Like for instance, lexical retrieval, local dependencies, phrase building, grammaticality check, and then even reanalysis if you are not satisfied with the meaning you have at the end of the day. So the idea is that why is ERP useful for this? Because the idea is that each of these different stages affects a specific ERP component or more than one, okay? So the idea is that by studying the modulation of this component triggered by your stimuli, your linguistic material that you provide to your participants, right? It's going to tell you something specifically about one of these stages and how your linguistic manipulation affects one of these stages, okay? If these stages exist at all. And for instance, a lot of psychologists don't like the word stages because that sounds very modular, very sort of serial processing like. Other people like to talk about processes, but then, it doesn't really matter a lot. So whether you call them stages or levels of processing, the idea is that these are different processes and they interact together in real time, okay? So again, what are these components and how do they look like? So for instance, this is an example of left anterior negativity, also called LAN, okay? Left, because it's elicited by the left electrodes, anterior, because it's elicited by the anterior electrodes, and negativity, because it's a negativity. So it's the negative wave compared to a positive wave, okay? Sorry, it's a comparison in two different conditions of something that is more negative in your critical condition as compared to something that is more positive in your control condition, okay? It is very important to remember that when we talk about components or psycholinguistic effects or psychophysiological effects like LAN, P600, N400, we always talk about comparing different conditions, okay? So when we talk about, for instance, P600, it's not just that you get a positive bump of processing or of EEG activity in a certain condition, but you're always comparing your critical condition to a control condition, okay? And if you remember, even yesterday, Joseph mentioned the importance about having good control condition. And I still remember Alice's question in the very first class that she was asking, like, okay, but why is this supposed to be a good control for this kind of experiment, right? When we were discussing Patterson's experiment, I think. So that's really important to bear in mind this issue, right? What we are talking about is always, it's also called a differential wave or differential effect. It's a difference between one condition and the other, okay? Yeah, so here you see your nice LAN for a sentence like, my niece wove a pot holder for me, good, for I, horrible. So big case violation, right? You need to use the accusative here. So if English doesn't have a case system, at least they have this one case and you better get it right, okay? So my niece wove a pot holder for I, horrible violation, very early negative deflection here of your grammatical violation compared to your control, okay? So this would be I versus me. I elicit this negativity very early at about 300 milliseconds. And then if you plot the differential wave, so one condition minus the other, then you see your effect, okay? And so this would be in your anterior electrodes, especially left anterior electrodes, okay? But then if you go in posterior electrodes and more later in time, after 600 milliseconds from the onset of your critical word, again, me versus I, then you see that me now is not above, but it is below. So in the standard plotting, negativity is plotted upwards and positivity downwards. I think this is a kind of a radiological convention or a neurological convention, whatever. So when you see this difference, something that is more downwards means that is more positive, means that you have a positive effect. Positivity after 600 milliseconds, called P600, okay? And then you can plot your nice scalp distribution of the effect, and you see how this is distributed in your scalp. Very important, if you find an effect in your anterior electrodes, it does not mean that it's produced by the anterior part of the brain. Might well be generated by your posterior part, but then the way it gets out of your scalp, distorted by your meninges, distorted by your bones, and also given the directionality of the electric flow, it might just pop out there, okay? But as you might remember, EEG is not really good for localizing effects. Is this clear? Is this premise and introduction clear? If you have any question, please stop me, okay? Otherwise, I'll continue.
Just
yes,
one.
Please.
Even though it's not the origin of the signal, is it reproducible that it's always occurring in the left or measurable in the left anterior part of the brain? Yes, it should be, right? Well, otherwise you can't.
You mean in the left anterior part of the electrodes, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Very good question. Yes, that is the assumption that you want to make if you do ERP studies. Okay.
Okay.
So the reason why actually this became such a strong methodology for psycholinguistic investigation is that some of these effects are very, very solid and very, very reproducible. Okay. So that's exactly the critical point to your question. So yes, they are reproducible. Some of them, and some of them not so, right? So then again, you have problems. And that's exactly where we're going to go today. All right, so first of all, ELAN versus LAN, okay? If you happen to live in Germany, then you might have a lot of ELANs, because this is actually something that is pushed by Angela Frederici, and not by chance, but because this effect is often elicited by German sentences, okay? So that might also depend on some properties of German where you really have some local dependency made explicit. Many people are skeptical about this. But the idea is that this ELAN, first of all, it's found, you cannot find in Broca's patients. So then the inference that maybe is produced by Broca's area. And then you would find, if you have a low proportion of grammatical violation of ill-formed sentences, you only find it in a mature brain, so later than 13 years of age. And what does it reflect? It's supposed to reflect the partial expectation that the incoming word will be of a particular type, okay? So if I just say the, you expect a noun, and I give you the walking, so the walked, or the to be, right? And then you're like, oh my God, this is horrible, because your brain already made up an NP or a DP, a determiner phrase, because you have a determiner, is really waiting for a noun. You don't get the noun, horrible violation, okay? And it also indexes some early automatic processing of local phrase structure building. What does it mean, local phrase structure building? That you are within a single phrase. So you're within your DP, you start building your DP, you have your determiner, you're really waiting for the argument, which must be a noun, okay? And very early, like between 100 and 300 milliseconds. But then some people found it later, between 3 and 500 milliseconds. So some people say this is just an early instance of a LAN, which is a more general component, reflecting word category violation. So again, very, very similar issue. Agreement violation. If you have a rich morphology in your language, then you might have, plural determiner versus a singular determiner. In English, you have the, so that's not really helpful. But in Italian, you might have il versus I, or in German, you have der versus die, right? So yeah, die Kunden, or die Kinder or der Kunden would be bad. And then also you can also get it with some long distance dependencies with no violation. So even in grammatical sentences, and this is interesting. So that suggests you that this is not just about detecting grammaticality, okay? Can you give me an example of a long distance dependency in language? Do you remember any?
Questions?
Not really, right? I mean, I don't know exactly what kind of, if you're thinking about the subject verb inversion, is that what you're thinking about?
No, I thought about V movement.
Verb movement, yeah. So no, that would be more a specific kind of movement. So like more like head movement, right?
What about verb brackets? Like in German, where you have like part of the verb in the beginning of the sentence and then another part in the end, or also not?
Yes, that would be that. To me, that would sound like a long distance dependency, but I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not acknowledged enough, but I know I can tell you, the typical case for this would be, for instance, binding. Okay, so John went to the market and he found a very nice picture of himself. Okay, himself refers to he or to John. Okay. Yeah. And other examples, yeah, probably you're right. So in all these languages where you have like a sort of a particle at the very end of the phrase, which sort of which has a very strict syntactic dependency with another one at the beginning, that's a long distance dependency. So the problem for the brain, for the cognitive system, is that you have to keep in mind, you have to keep active the representation of the first morpheme or the first functional element in order then to complete basically the syntactic composition with the element occurring at the very end. Okay, so that's something that increase complexity. There you find the LAN.
Can I ask something?
Please.
What about garden path effects? Does something similar happen there?
Hold your question. We're gonna find some example like that. Okay. The easy answer is that with the garden path, you usually find P600. Okay. So my answer to this is that if it is very difficult to elicit these kind of effects, and many people do not believe in this kind of effect. I mean, of course, a lot of papers found them, right? But I will show you that, or for instance, for the LAN, there is a big problem that the LAN actually overlaps with another very important component, which is an M400. So it's not clear which one it is, which one. But for very, very important and strong parsing related effect, what you're gonna find usually is not this, but this, okay, the P600. So we'll go there in a second. Right, so what people claim...
Sorry, I have a question too. So when you say a long distance dependency, are you suggesting that LAN is only elicited with like a dependency that has a sizable distance, or does the distance matter? Is that what you're implicating by saying long distance as opposed to just dependency?
Yes, I mean, I'm not claiming that, right? I'm just reporting what what Federici claimed. But that's the idea. So the problem about a long distance dependency compared to a short distance dependency, right, is that you have to, I mean, from the processing perspective, is that you have to hold in mind the specific syntactic representation of the trigger of the first element of this dependency, because you cannot sort of, you cannot create the constituent, or you cannot close the constituent, or you cannot merge that element with its argument until you get what you really need in order for the syntactic computation to be finalized and the composition to be sort of closed, right? I mean, I'm not sure.
So
yeah,
long distance means there's at least one intervening word. What counts as a long distance dependency?
Yeah, I guess that you have more than one word within. So anything where you have a strong syntactic dependency between two elements and more than one word in between, I think it's considered as long distance.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
Can you give me another example? Other than yeah.
That's a different use of this word than in the syntactic literature, because I think in syntax, when you say long distance dependency, you have a causal boundary between the two things, and everything else is short, usually.
Really? Like, oh, that's interesting. So, like, you mean something that is beyond the close, across the board?
Yeah, I think that's called long distance. Well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is for certain specific phenomena in syntax, but yeah, just depending on the context, long distance means different things. But, okay, thank you.
I mean, it is an interesting question. I should look into this, but I'm quite sure. I mean, binding is the paradigmatic example of long distance dependency in psycholinguistics. So I guess binding would be within the same clause, right?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
I guess.
Right.
Depending on the language. So like in Chinese, you can have himself licensed by something in a higher clause, and you say that's a long distance binding.
Right. So yes, so that's actually, yeah, it's a very, very, very cool comment. So there is ambiguity in this kind of definition, right?
Right. Yes.
I guess, you know, when you talk about psycholinguistics, then you tend to simplify things. But take my
Right.
words with caution. So I will I will check this, okay? Because I think this is an important point. But yeah, thanks for raising this
Okay.
point. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
should
but
I
you-
answer your question,
Sorry?
or should students answer the question? Your question about other kinds of long distance.
Yeah. No, please do.
So I guess NPI licensing is another one.
Right. So MPI licensing is a very debatable issue, right? So whether it's like a semantic or a syntactic or both, right?
Yeah. And you worked on it.
Yeah, maybe I'm going to talk about that today.
Yeah, I think you should. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you stop interrupting me, and maybe I'm gonna. Of course, I'm kidding. But yeah, very good point, right? So it's not just about syntax. You might have, in general, dependencies that are also based on certain semantic issues, and then people tend to use these kind of components as a sort of a litmus test. So that's, you know, when I tried to publish this paper, I got busted because they told me that my argument was a little bit circular. So that I was trying to use psycholinguistic component to test the nature of the phenomenon that I was studying. And then I was using assumption on the phenomenon that I was studying to test the nature of the psycholinguistic effects that I would get. So, you know, you have to be careful with this. And you will see that it's going to be a mess in a few slides, okay? But yeah, the idea is that you have a lot of grammatical long distance dependencies, and you need in your cognitive system to retain these things in a working memory. So that's why they say that probably this might not be a specific linguistic related process, but it might be something more about the general working memory processes, or subsequent stage of processing devoted to thematic role assignment, or the look back and look forward suggestion triggered by displaced sentence constituents. Who knows? Okay. So yeah, so let's move to P600, which is actually one of the most famous and more frequently found ERP effects. And it's found in a lot of different violations. It's very common for ungrammaticality. So more common than LAN, okay? But also for subject agreement violation, and also for violation of inflection, case, phrase structure, high level syntactic constraint, syntactic complexity, garden path, so Valerie's question, long distance dependencies again, so Yasu's concern. So you already see that one of the problem, right? That many of these components are not selective for one specific process. And, you know, people have been claiming maybe, again, it's a general purpose response to low probability target events, or a probability to assign a given structure to a parser, or a late control syntactic reanalysis and repair, or syntactic integration of parsing difficulty, all these things together, okay? So it's not clear at the specific level what these components reflect, but at a kind of a broad general level, it is safe, you know, it would be a safe thing to say that if you have a grammatical sentence in your stimuli, you should get a P600. And if you don't get that, that's either a problem or an interesting issue, okay? So example, now you tell me what this is, right? Der Vater trug den Mantel, okay? Dem Vater getragen hat den Mantel. Can anyone tell me what this is? What is the difference between these two sentences?
The focus is different.
The first one is past tense, and the second one is present perfect tense.
Right. So we have a difference in the tense, right? This is a
Past tense
complex tense.
and hat getragen is
Yeah.
is present perfect.
And also,
Like,
Olivia,
isn't it perfect?
yeah, the perfect, right? This is present perfect. And also Olivia said that the focus structure seems to be different in this sentence, right? So you do have some scrambling here. Okay, so this is more complex syntactically than this one. And then you have the same version of these two sentences with the mistake, right? So where is the mistake? Trugen, wrong verb inflection. And and here you don't have the verb. You just dropped the hat, right? So very nice design. Oh yeah, and this is supposed to be the hardcore syntactic representation of this sentence, where you do a lot of crazy syntactic stuff. Okay. So right. So if you read the paper, that they would say that in sentence 2 is more complex because the derivation of 2, the auxiliary head has to raise to C0, and the dative plus the verb must be fronted. So very good, focus fronting as a constituent to spec CP. To accomplish this, the accusative DP has to be scrambled out of the inner VP, leaving a trace in the accusative argument position next to the verb. Very, 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 that's why I cannot learn German, basically. All right, so you see that there are 4 conditions, and that there's some very, very simple predictions that can be made out of this, right? One prediction is that condition 1 is easier than condition 3 because condition 3 had a mistake. And ungrammatical sentences are more difficult to process. At least they elicit some kind of repair because our brain is super smart and our cognitive system is super cool that tries to fix the problem in our linguistic input, because that's a very adaptive behavior. Because if your interlocutor says a lot of crazy stuff, then you actually can understand what it's saying, although it's making some mistake. Okay. So condition with a mistake should be easier than the condition without a mistake, but also condition 2 should be more difficult than condition 1, or condition 1 should be easier than condition 2 because it requires some more complex syntactic processing, probably revision, if you have this kind of focus fronting movement, right? So yeah. So right. So the question that Federici raised was that if processes related to revision, to syntactic revision in grammatical sentences, are different from the processes related to repair, so your automatic repair of an illicit structure, then you might find a psychophysiological profile, so an ERP effect, an ERP activation different in condition 2 versus condition 3. Okay. So first of all, condition 1 should be processed differently from both condition 2 and condition 3 because it's simpler. Second, these 2 conditions should be processed differently because they have they increase complexity in a different way. This has a mistake, this one, and this one actually has a more complex syntactic operations going on, and arguably a syntactic revision in order to make this focus fronting thing, okay? So now we compare the simple versus the incorrect, okay? And in this comparison, what you see is an N400 wave, which is the fact that the dotted line is above the solid line here, okay? Followed by your nice, huge P600 effect, where your dotted line is below the solid line, okay? So again, you see that the N400 is kind of spread out the whole electrodes, but maximum in your central sides, central parietal usually, whereas your P600 it's positive and it's also posterior. So it's very small here and it's much larger in your positive electrode, okay? It's a typical profile, typical biphasic profile composed by an N400 followed by a P600. And you see that very well in the central electrode because you see this difference here and then the opposite, the flip later in time, okay? Cool. So now let's compare this to the simple versus complex conditions, okay? So this is grammatical now, the present perfect plus focus fronting condition. Then what you see that your P600 is not greater anymore in posterior electrodes, but it's more widespread on your scalp, specifically is present in your frontal electrodes, which is why this has been called frontal P600 or distributed P600, broadly distributed P600, as compared to the classic P600, which was maximum in posterior electrodes, okay? So, and then you see your N400 is much, much smaller, almost no N400, okay? So conclusions. Yes, from this we can infer that different processes are dealing with sentence repair, classic posterior P6, versus licit reanalysis, frontal P6, or broadly distributed P6, okay? Problems. Why did we get an N400? I haven't told you what an N400 is, but it was there. So what is an N400? Something that is generally associated with semantic anomalies. Okay? So why did we get it for a syntactic violation? Who knows? Is this clear? Is these results and the conclusions that the authors drew from these results clear? You see the difference? Okay. So now let's move to the N400, which is actually another very, very important and very frequently found psycholinguistic or psychophysiological effect. And usually it is found for unrelated, unrepeated words, pseudo words or non-words, open class words versus closed class words, low frequency words versus high frequency words, semantic, contextual, word knowledge violation, unpredicted continuations, isolated words versus words in context, jokes, prose, and difficult memory retrieval in words and sentences. And it is not found in patients with some impairment in temporal and inferior parietal lobes, okay, where arguably you have your semantic memory, but it is still found with patients with impairment in perisylvian regions, so in Broca's area and Wernicke's area, okay, which suggests that the generator of this is not Broca's, neither Broca's nor Wernicke, somewhere else, probably in your temporal parietal lobes. Okay, so what does it reflect? Probably reflects semantic processing, semantic contextual integration, but also lexical retrieval, conceptual retrieval from long memory, but also semantic memory processing, and also search in semantic memory, okay? And why not semantic conceptual unification and composition? So you think all this is basically making up for the whole semantic processing you might ever think of, right? What probably is not included here is sort of low-level compositional semantic violation or logical violation, but I'm gonna put that also into the minestrone. All right, multimodal integration as well. Okay, so a lot of stuff. Nice. So, do you want to have a break right now, or should we go on for a few more minutes? Who wants to have a break? Raise your thumb or make some noise. 1, 2. 3. Okay, let's have a break. Let's have a 5 minutes break, okay? And let's meet each other in 5 minutes. So, yeah, hi everyone again. Do you see my screen?
I don't. Oh, now I do. Yes.
No, yes, yeah. Good. Right. So, I don't know why that's like this. Okay, now I only see, oh, whatever. Okay, so this is a very interesting study, and it's also very telling, because I think there is a big flow in this study, and this flow is very indicative of certain misrepresentation in the field of linguistic processes and representations. Anyways, the idea of Haggard et al. So this study was published in Science, so it kind of became very famous. It's about the investigation of semantics violation versus word knowledge violations. Okay, am I on the right? Yeah. So the idea was to look for evidence for separate circuits in processing semantics in general. No, in general, semantics as a specific linguistic process versus word knowledge in general. So what is included in your semantic memory, your knowledge about things, okay? And the idea was to adopt this contrast. So the control would be Dutch trains are yellow and very crowded, okay? And if you are Dutch, in the zeros, you would supposed to have a strong bias for your national trains to be yellow. Okay, so yes, Dutch trains are yellow and very crowded. This is true, and every Dutch person knows that this is true. So it's a control true sentence. And the word knowledge violation would be that Dutch trains are white and very crowded. Dutch trains are not white. Okay, and then they came up with this linguist semantic violation, which is the Dutch trains are sour and very crowded. Okay, so I put my interpretation of a sour train. So the idea is that the NP Dutch train cannot really compose with the adjective sour, okay, because sour requires something that is a food as an argument. So what did I find? N400. So here you see a very nice example of an N400 in all its beauty, right? With a perfect peak at 400 milliseconds after the presentation of the critical word yellow, white, sour. So the 3 sentences were exactly the same, only the critical word would be different. And you see the scalp representation of the N400, very standard, typical representation in this paper is in your centroparietal electrodes, a little bit more to the right, okay? A little bit more asymmetrical, exactly like this. And this is your negativity. So you see, this is actually a 4 millivolts, big effect, super significant. Cool. So what do you see? There is no difference between the effect elicited by sour and the effect elicited by white, okay? So same N400, same amplitude of the effect, same topography. Therefore, the processes that are activated by this anomaly are supposed to be the same, okay? But then they said, okay, but maybe they just elicit the same brainwave, as measured with ERP. But then if you do an fMRI study, you're going to find a different activation, because we know that fMRI is way more sensitive to localizing effect in the cortex. Okay, so that's what I did. Same experiment with fMRI, same activation for the word knowledge violation and the linguistic semantic violation. Where is this activation? Guess where? This is your left lobe. This is your anterior part of the brain, left inferior prefrontal cortex, specifically BA 45 and 47. Okay. So you should remember, I mean, he calls it left inferior prefrontal cortex, but this is actually the same as your left inferior frontal cortex. Okay. And so it's your Broca's area, except that the Broca's area is specifically defined at BA 44 and 45. This is a part of Broca's area, and the more anterior part, which you might remember is more involved into semantics processing. There you go. Partial overlap with Broca's area. Conclusions: word meaning and word knowledge are integrated very rapidly, so within 400 milliseconds. And your LIPC or LIFG or BA 45, 47 is involved in the computation of the meaning and the integration of your linguistic expression with your word knowledge. Evidence for a two-step meaning interpretation procedure by which you first determine your sentence meaning via some grammatical computation, and then you verify it against your word knowledge in a second time. Everything happens in the same time because there is no timing difference in the two violations. Not only that, but also no evidence that distinct circuits are processing linguistic violations and word knowledge violations. Okay? So the sour trains and the white trains elicit the same effect. Now, I want to ask you, do you have any critique to move against this experiment, or to move against the characterization of Haggard and colleagues of word knowledge violation and semantic violation? If you have, tell me. If you don't,
Like, it's like the same thing, like the fact that, I mean, you don't eat trains, so that's like word knowledge, but the fact that Dutch trains are not white is also word knowledge. So both of these cases are word knowledge.
right. So his objection could be that, yeah, okay, you're right, but like you cannot really compose the adjective sour with the word train, right? And then if you're a linguist, you say, no, this is bullshit. You can. I just showed you the picture of a sour train. There you go.
Yeah, I don't get the picture. What's on the what is this? It's too small for my screen.
It's made of vegetables and some sour cream that I'm suggesting might be there. Okay.
Wait, what's the sour? Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just my knowledge about vegetables is not very. But you see Yasu's point, right? That this is not really a semantic violation as we would think of it in linguistic terminology. In fact, sour and train can compose. And in fact, you might think about the sour train that you eat, okay? Of course, it's not very common, but it's not unthinkable, okay? So thanks, Yasu, for this objection, and let's keep it for later, okay? But it's interesting to see that they got the same effect. All right, so let's move to another issue that I like. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want to give you the main information, because this was a big thing in psycholinguistics. Okay, so The classic view this is the one that I try to outline is that the P600 is really sensitive to syntactic anomalies and grammaticality and syntactic processes like revision and reanalysis. Whereas the M400 indexes semantic anomalies, conceptual integration, word knowledge violation, and anything that is implausible or unpredictable from the point of view of the meaning, okay? Then Gina Kuperberg proposed a slightly alternative interpretation of this, which is the following. The P600 is not really reflecting syntax, but rather combinatorics. So linguistic grammatical driven processing operations. And he talks about the processing streams that goes on in your brain, okay? Compared to this, N400 is really reflecting a sort of constant interaction with your semantic memory. So it's a semantic memory-based processing stream as compared to a more linguistic-based processing stream. So in simple words, the difference between the P600 and the N400 has been moved from a syntax versus semantics contrast to a linguistic versus a non-linguistic contrast, okay? Where also the linguistic level, syntax and semantics matter. So I'm not going to use the word combinatorial a lot because I find it very, very vague, right? Because you can have some sort of concept combinatorial idea of composing concepts, and that would be still a sort of non-linguistics. So I think it introduces some confusion, but you know, people use it a lot. So yeah. So why did Kuperberg come up with this view? Because some very interesting effects were found in the first decade of the 2000s, like this very famous experiment by Kuperberg and colleagues. They would present a sentence like, every morning at breakfast, the boys would eat, versus every morning at breakfast, the boy would plant, or every morning at breakfast, the eggs would eat. What was the interesting effect they found? That with the boy would plant, you would get an N400 effect. Because planting something in the morning, it's something very, very weird and unpredictable, right? You would not expect that the boys would plant plants in the morning, but they would eat. However, big surprise, the sentence, every morning at breakfast, the eggs would eat, elicited a P600 and not an N400, okay? Why? Because arguably, your cognitive system is smart enough to figure out that this sentence is better fixed by switching the thematic role of eggs from the agent of eating to the patient of eating, so the object of what is being eaten, okay? So your cognitive system, within a few milliseconds, would immediately figure out that this is actually not a real word knowledge violation, but it's just a formal problem, and that can be easily fixed by basically moving the eggs to the object position, okay? And this would be the explanation why you get a P600. So this effect has been called semantic P600, okay? Yeah. So the syntactic reanalysis would give you something like the eggs would be eaten, so in a passive form.
Can I ask something?
Please.
Would it make a difference if you choose a word other than eggs, which is related to breakfast? If you choose, I don't know, every morning at breakfast, the books would eat, or cars?
Right. So this is exactly
Okay.
the kind of question that they ask in future experiments. The answer is yes, right?
Okay.
At least
I
according
guess so,
to,
yeah.
yes. But then they don't always find the right the right effect. So we are going to go through that a little bit. And another very nice replication of this effect was by Kim and Osterhout, where they used this sentence: the hearty meal was devouring compared to the dusty tabletops were devouring. Okay, so the dusty tabletops cannot be really fixed syntactically, so then they would elicit an N400. But the hearty meal was devouring. Again, you associate devouring with the meal by actually being you the agent of the devouring, right? So again, same thing. Triggers a syntactic reanalysis. The meal was devoured. So this triggered a kind of a large program, research program, to investigate which factors would trigger this P600, this semantics P600 effect. And then, as you suggested, they start playing with a lot of manipulations, like, for instance, using different words, and especially addressing the question of which factors determine the trigger for the P600, right? And whether a sentence can be repaired. Is it about the thematic role assignments from the VP to the MP? Is it about the violation of the animacy constraint? Or is it semantic associations between words, as you were kind of suggesting, right? So I'm going to go quite quickly through these experiments because we don't have a lot of time to discuss this in detail, but the idea is that many of these factors played a role. So is it whether a sentence can be repaired? No, because this was also triggered by, to make good documentaries, cameras must interview, right? So it's not easy to switch to repair this just by turning into to a passive sentence. Is it a semantic associations? Yes, but not necessarily, right? So this was at long last, the man's pain was understood by the doctor versus by the medicine versus by the pens. And they found that actually both the pens and the medicine triggered this P600, but also an N400. Whereas the violinist did not trigger the P600. Was it the participant task? Yes. So they found that you would have this semantic P600 when the task was a plausibility judgment, but not in passive reading. Is it the role of the context? Yes. So they found it when you had a context. So the woman told the suitcase would trigger the P600, but not the woman told the suitcase with no context, okay? So a lot of factors determine whether you can have this effect, which also tells you about the flexibility of the system and the issue of different processing streams interacting with each other. So yeah, Kuperberg's view is that these two processing streams are relatively independent, but they interact together from the very first milliseconds of processing. So the P600 is actually sensitive to semantic thematic assignment, where animacy plays a big role, also to morphosyntactic composition, and to reanalysis in general, if the first parse of the linguistic input contains a syntactic or a semantic anomaly. So that's evidence to say that the P600 is not just syntax. It's really dependent on the kind of process that triggers. In comparison to this, the N400 is really something that is elicited by the nature of the associative categorical relations between the content words. So it's really dependent on some sort of check retrieval processing in the semantic memory, where you store all your knowledge about the word and your knowledge about the content words, so about nouns and verbs, and interacts with lexical semantics information. Okay. So yeah. So you see there's a little bit of switch in the paradigm, but still, you know, there is this kind of, I mean, this supports the idea that a lot of processes that are very syntax related are actually associated with the P600 component. Okay, so it's not completely incompatible with the previous view, but it adds a little bit more. It sort of suggests that you can have this effect induced by sentences that, if you interpret them just by following the grammatical rules, you would predict to have an N400. Okay. Now, are there problems with this view as well? Is it true that linguistic semantic violations only elicit P600? Is it true that semantics combinatorics only affect the P600 processing stream? Would say the skeptical hippo. No, the idea is that, I mean, like I'm sort of suggesting sort of a provoking idea is that actually you don't need to run a lot of new fancy experiments involving crazy objects talking to each other, but you might just look at a very large literature on psycholinguistics electrified to find a lot of effects that are not easy to integrate with this kind of hypothesis. So that's why I called it the N400 conspiracy. Okay. So this is a kind of sort of a joke. Don't take it too seriously. But the idea is that sometimes there is some evidence that conflicts with the mainstream theory, and this evidence is kind of hidden or disguised as to different components. So sometimes you get N400 and you do not report it, or you rename it as a LAN, or you report it as unexplained, and then it's not going to be considered by part of the research. Right, so now I'm going to give you a quick tour of unexplained N400, okay? And then you make of that what you want. So let's take this example. Frederici, Pfeiffer, and Hahn, 93, they had a morphosyntactic and syntactic violation presented auditorily, and they found this negative deflection here at about half a second, so perfectly in the time window of the N400, and then they interpreted it as a lexical process, okay? So they said, yes, these are syntactic violation, but given that a syntactic violation also gives you a more difficult lexical access of the content word because it has not been pre-activated, then you would get an N400 as well. But still, it was a pure syntactic violation, like the cloud was buried or the parquet was polished with the verb wrong inflection, or the friend was in the visited, blah, blah, and for all this. Then another experiment, Rosler et al., they found an N400 like for syntactic violation. The teacher is being fallen, okay? But they report it as a LAN. So if you look here, it is a little bit great. It is a bit larger in the left anterior electrodes, but still present in the right electrodes and also present in the posterior electrodes. So that's not the typical distribution on the scalp of a LAN. So this looks like an N400, or at least some overlap between an N400 and a LAN, okay? Munte et al., they had story reading with pseudo words. Again, problematic interpretation as an N400 or a LAN. You see it is in anterior electrodes, but it's also in central electrodes. This one as well, Colson et al. The N400 was interpreted as a LAN again, with sentences with the pronoun case and verb agreement violation. And again, see, they really wrote it LAN in the paper, but then you find it in the central electrodes and in the parietal electrodes, and also in the occipital electrodes. So This is not a LAN. This looks like an N400. And same for Gunther, Stove, and Mulder. They found an N400 for syntactic violations interpreted as LAN, just because it was a little bit earlier. Again, Gunther and Frederici. Word category violation. The white teeth were by the brush. Verb inflection violation. Again, N400. And yeah, so they just reported it. At least they reported it as an N400. Huge for word category violation. So again, these are violations that should give you just a P600 or a LAN and a P600, given what we have said so far, right? More unexplained N400. So here they had, I guess, case violation, right? And this was N400 interpreted as a difficulty to deal with more wrong arguments. So the more mismatching arguments you have, the more thematic processing you have to do, the more N400 you're going to get. But then again, thematic processing, argument structure, all syntactic stuff, right? Or combinatorial syntactic-based processes. They're not processes that really tap onto semantic memory, onto word knowledge memory, right? Good. Can et al. N400 for who versus whether. Unexplained. Why who should give you more semantic activation than whether? And then Frisch and Slesensky, N400 for semantic violation with both animate arguments and P600 for all other violations. So they concluded that when you have animate arguments, then the thematic violation would give you an N400. But why? Frederici et al. 2002. This is the paper we talked about, right? N400 interpreted as distributed negativity due to lexical thematic integration. So sometimes you just call it in a different way, but this is not really distributed negativity. This is a very nice N400 maximum in your centroparietal electrode, okay? Sometimes you would just call it in a different way in order not to have your reviewers destroy your paper. And again, other experiments, N400 for animate and grammatical condition, P600 for the other ungrammatical conditions, okay? So the take-home message is that we don't really know what is going on. The problem is that all these examples are counter arguments to both the classic interpretation of the N400, which says that it's a semantic problem related to access to lexicon or semantic memory, but also to more recent interpretation like Gina Kuperberg's interpretation, which says that anything that is sort of linguistic grammar related should be in the combinatorial P600 processing stream, whereas the N400 is really related about access to semantic memory. Now, many people say, yeah, but you know, when you get these effects, that's because ungrammatical sentences result in a difficult lexical access of the word inducing the grammatical problem or following the grammatical problem, right? Because in a way, you know, your predictive power during the online processing is sort of diminished, and you get surprisal for the word that you would not expect because of the grammatical problem. Yeah, okay, but then you would predict to get an N400 for any grammatical violation, because any grammatical violation in a way disrupts the normal lexical access, but that's not what we get. There's a lot of studies where you don't get any N400, you only get an P600, okay? So I'm not going to give you any solution to this, right? But we have to notice, to be aware that there are all these unexplained N400 and problems. Okay, so yeah, so today we talked about these two papers here, the nice chapter about psycholinguistic electrified, which summarize these issues, and also this paper by Frederici. And now I would move to these other slides, which I haven't posted yet, but I will post them. So I'm gonna, oh, sorry. Okay. Good. Okay. Do you see the slides? Yeah, good. Right. So yeah, so in these slides, you see there is some stuff about formal neurolinguistics that I skipped, and you know, if you're interested, you're free to read it and to discuss about that. But yeah, I decided to skip it because I would like to dedicate some more time to other issues about semantic processing. So I would just start from this point, which is quite interesting because it refers again to the Haggard et al. Study. Okay, so their objection to that study is a little bit like what Yasu said. So the idea is that Haggard et al. Study does not really distinguish between lexical and compositional semantics. So the idea that Dutch trains are white or that are sour, right, is that these are both conceptual lexical semantics violations. Okay, they might be thought of as violation of your word knowledge or your, the compositional struggle to compose two words that are either very unlikely to be composed given what you know about things, white trains or sour trains. So they're both composable, and that's why they elicit the same neurophysiological effect. So no surprise that he found the same N400 and the same activation of BA45 and 47, because actually sour trains is as composable as white trains. So how can we come up with a more subtle contrast, linguistic contrast, to study something that is really violating the semantic linguistic rules? Verbal unprefixation was the answer of Pilkanen, Olivieri, and Smart. So what is verbal unprefixation? It's an operation by which a verb predicate receives a reversative meaning. So for instance, the idea is that unbutton a shirt means undo the result of buttoning a shirt. The interesting thing about this operation is that it is semantically constrained. So for instance, it requires an accomplishment verb. Okay, an accomplishment verb like button is a verb that leads to a change of state representing an accomplishment. So that your shirt is buttoned after you button it. Okay. So yeah, so it requires an event structure involving a change of state. So take, for instance, the wine. The wine was being uncorked. It's completely fine. Okay. You have a corking process. And then, corking, you have corking the wine, and then with the uncorking process, you remove the cork. But what about unchilling? If you have a sentence like the thirst was being unchilled, okay, it's not impossible to conceive. It's like, you sort of quench your thirst by unchilling it, right? The thing is that the idea is that this is a semantic and compositional violation because unchilling is not impossible to conceive, but it's semantically banned from our grammar because it's not exactly the kind of verb as uncorking or unbuttoning. So it's not an accomplishment verb, okay? So, right. Whereas the thirst was being uncorked, that's really something like sour trains. Because, yeah, thanks. Because it's, you know, it doesn't make any sense. It's like completely violating our knowledge because there is no cork in the third, okay? So you see the idea of this experiment is that you could use a verb which would give you a reasonable meaning, but it's banned from the grammar because of certain requirements of this operation, okay? And this would represent a pure linguistic semantic violation compared to this, which is more like a word knowledge violation. Is this clear? Okay. So what they found, so this was an MEG experiment. And if you remember, the MEG is really cool because it kind of unifies the advantage of the EEG, so very high temporal resolution, and the advantage of fMRI, very high power of localizing effects on the cortex, so very high spatial resolution. And what they found is that both violations, so uncorking the thirst and unchilling the thirst, generate an effect at your left inferior frontal cortex, okay? So the same area where Haggard found the effect for the two violations he employed. And you see, this is very nice. It's both plotted on your cortex, right? So this is your Broca's area, and this is the more anterior part of your Broca's area. But also you have the perfect timing. So you have an additional information with respect to the fMRI study, and you see this effect pops out at about 300 milliseconds. So very, very synchronized, very much synchronized with the M400 effect. But cool enough, only the semantic compositional violation elicited effects at the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So now we are introducing a new area of interest, which is called VMPFC, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is not far from the inferior prefrontal cortex, but as the word says, it's a little bit more ventral, so it's more depth into the cortex, okay? And interestingly, this effect was even earlier than the one elicited in the inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so I'm not sure. I don't think it is in the. I didn't plot it here, but what you can see is that in the word violation condition, there was no. So I guess this is the effect. Oh yeah, sorry. I'm a little bit tired. Okay, so this refers to the effect in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and this refers to the effect on the left inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so here you see the effect on the left inferior frontal gyrus in both conditions with exactly the same timing. Very nice. But then when you look at what happens in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and you see where it is. So this is a picture from underneath the brain, right? So it's a little bit more medially, so more in the middle of the brain, and more ventral, so more in depth, okay? And here you only have this effect, significant, with the semantic violation. So with the semantic linguistic violation, with uncorking, unchilling the thirst, but not with uncorking the third. So here, with the word violation, you have no effect in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, okay? So their conclusion was that, yes, Haggard was wrong. Compositional operations involve distinct brain network with respect to conceptual violations. For instance, compositional operations may precede the integration of meaning and knowledge, so contrary to what Haggard claimed, and they found a very nice new locus for semantic composition, which is this ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So this very region showed also higher activation for increased compositional complexity. So an example of coercion. So like begin the book, which requires a sort of a covert element, like begin to read the book, right? So in sentences like begin the book compared to sentences that would not involve this sort of coercion of the event predicate, they found the same effect in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So yeah, so the conclusion was that cool. Actually, if your experimental methodology is smart enough, and if your contrast is fine-grained enough to capture with differences, then you would find differences between processes dedicated to compose the meaning of different words and processes that are more geared to integrate the meaning with the word knowledge. Okay, and the specific linguistic semantic processes are a little bit earlier and are only triggered by real linguistic violation. Okay. Okay, so what should I do? Is there any question related to these experiments? Do they seem quite clear, quite reasonable?
I just had a thought.
So if you are not too tired,
Daniele, can I
yes,
ask you something?
please.
What about words like Twitter or Google that slowly turned into some sort of verbs, like let me Google that for you, which initially might seem odd and might not fit? Is there a transition visible also, or
yeah,
people test that?
I'm sure someone might have tested neologisms. That's a very interesting question. Yeah, I don't know.
Fair enough.
I can check it for the next time. Okay.
Just popped up.
But yeah, but it's interesting because yeah, you're right. I mean, they sort of require a similar process of modifying the lexical structure of a given word, right? So you would turn a noun into a verb. I know that they actually investigated I think some related operations like of nominalization and stuff like this. But I don't know about any study investigating this, but I'm gonna look into that. Yeah, thanks. Interesting question. Yeah. So if you're not too tired, I will talk a little bit about this study for 10 minutes. But if you are too tired, we stop here. Okay. So let's make a quick poll. Who wants me to introduce this study? Raise your thumb. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Who is tired and would prefer me to stop now? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So I guess, I mean, the yes party.
Yeah, but those who are tired can leave, and those who are interested can stay. So let's.
No. Like, you know, but the purpose of this is that I should, you know, talk about things where everyone is actually on the same page, and also, yeah, probably.
You talk about it the next time? Or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So next time we are gonna start with this, okay? So, right. So let's introduce this topic, which is really important when we are a little bit more fresh, with a little bit fresher, okay? Now we can, I mean, we can introduce the topic a little bit probably, and then we start, we come back to this next time, okay? So I don't go through the whole experiment. I'm just gonna tell you a couple of things about this, okay? So yeah, so now so basically the focus now is put on how do we process negation in real time. So we have seen that, for instance, we have this, we have seen that, for instance, the N400 is very sensitive to a lot of different kind of violations, right? Even grammatical violations. But what is the relationship between, for instance, making a word, a lexical item, more salient, or making a lexical item primed, which means that, for instance, you present a picture that is referring to a word, right? For instance, a picture of a lion, where I'm talking about a lion. What is the relationship between this and the computation of the meaning of a sentence? Especially with respect to these operators like negation, which flip the truth value of a sentence, the meaning of a sentence, okay? So I'm just gonna give you this example, okay? In front of the tower, there is no ghost, okay? What does this sentence mean? Well, it means that we are talking about a tower, and in front of this tower, whatever is there, it's not a ghost, okay? Well, that's not super surprising, because you know, ghosts are not the things that we would expect in front of towers. But then if I show you a ghost, then the paradox is that the word ghost is going to be primed, is going to be activated in your lexicon because you are actually seeing a ghost. But the meaning of the sentence tells you that you don't have to think about a ghost because there is no ghost, okay? So the question is, how do you interpret this sentence? What is the process ongoing in your mind when you have to interpret a negative sentence? So one hypothesis is that, is that first you simulate in your mind, you build up a picture of a ghost in front of the tower, okay? And then once you did that, then you suppress it because you know that that is not what the sentence means, okay? Right. And so compare, so, you know, if it is true that you have to do that, then, you know, seeing a real ghost might actually help because you actually see the ghost, right? You see what you have to build in order to interpret the sentence, and then you just suppress it. Now, compare that to what happens, for instance, when you have a picture of a lion, right? So now, forget about the ghost, look at this picture of a lion in front of the tower, and let's imagine you're listening to a sentence like, in front of the tower, there is no ghost, okay? Now, this picture would represent a scenario in which this sentence is true. And, you know, we've been knowing for a long time that when you have a picture that is matching the meaning of a sentence, you are actually happy. You are faster judging the truth of the sentence, right? However, if you have to first simulate the negated content and then suppress it, right? If I don't show you a ghost in the picture, then you are going to struggle a little bit more, because then you have to build a ghost in your mind and then suppress it, and then you get a lion, which is completely compatible with the meaning of the sentence. Okay? So I don't know if I made this clear, but the idea is, how does this happen in our mind? Do we simulate at any time the negated content, or we do not have to simulate it in your mind in order to understand what the sentence means? For instance, if you see a lion in front of the tower and you hear this sentence, do you have to mentally activate in your mind the picture of a ghost, or you don't care about that? So this is the question. And in the literature, historically speaking, there have been two main hypotheses. One is called the two-stage models, where you first process the meaning of negation and the propositional and the compositional content. You simulate the negated content, you compare that to the real scenario, and then you make your judgment. But compared to this, you have what is called an immediate integration model, where you immediately process negation and compositional content. You, at the same time, simulate the negated content and compare it to the real scenario. So there is one clear prediction that these two different models would make, that here you have a delay between the simulation of your negated content and then the real construction of the meaning of the sentence, whereas here you don't have any delay. You do everything at the same time. At the same time, you sort of create an image of a ghost in front of the tower and an image of something that could be there in front of the tower, and you compare them in real time. Here, you first have to go to your ghost, even if there is no ghost, and then you use that mental simulation in order to evaluate the sentence. Okay? So next time, we are going to talk a little bit about this. And the next time we meet is going to be actually on Tuesday, the 23rd at 5 p.m. So yes, that's it for today. Thanks, everyone. And as always, I'm going to stay here a couple of more minutes. So if you have any questions about anything, I'm going to be here. And have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Why is your paper called Formal Neurosemantics?